Thank you, Valerio. Thanks, everyone, and thank the organizer for bringing a bit of Africa to this symposium. It's, I think the challenges are in Africa, and we would all agree that there is a need for a specific action over there. So the title of my presentation is, as Valerio mentioned, Exploring Boundaries and Horizons about Phenotyping in the African Context. So I'll divide it into three parts, speaking a bit about plant phenotyping in the global north so far, what has been done, what are the perspectives, what's happening in Africa next, and a few questions for the entire audience. And as a community, how do we respond to these challenges? So I'll start a bit with the phenotyping in the global north in a very short way. And I just want to remind all of us that phenotyping is asking questions first. Because we've been witnessing lots of genomic progress. We've seen all these gadgets growing. But we need to remind ourselves that, most importantly, we need to have the right questions. If we don't have the right questions and we have all the answers, then there is no point of getting anywhere. And that's an important thing to remember, even in the African context, while we develop solutions for Africa that are specifically going there. And you all know that phenotyping infrastructure comes in different shapes and colors, all the way from semi-controlled conditions to data and computational services. And so far, in the last maybe 20 to 30 years, and I think you would all agree with me that most of the effort has been dedicated to developing this kind of infrastructure under controlled, semi-controlled conditions. I've taken two examples, and the survey that was done at IPPN in 2020 shows that most of 60% of the infrastructure is basically a plant-to-sensor infrastructure, and those are two examples. This one from Phenotyping in IMRA Montpellier, and the Netherlands at Wageningen. So Rick is here to speak about that, and I guess some other colleagues would also do. And that's what it was so far. Of course, these were quite useful to generate from a physiological perspective. I'm a crop physiologist, so it would generate lots of interesting data, like light interception efficiency on reconstructed multi-genotype canopy, like here in Phenotyping. It could also generate lots of interesting data, like leaf length variation under two water treatments, as you can see here, or even fine tracking of the stem tip, which is quite useful from a pure physiological perspective. But these robotized indoor phenotyping platforms are useful. I'm not saying otherwise, but how useful were they specifically in terms of breeding programs? And I invite you to check those two papers. Some of the authors are here. Roland, I guess, is here. And there's a recent interesting paper last year by François Tardieu asking to which extent these traits that we look at in those phenotyping platforms are useful and are translated somehow to what we observe in the field. And the conclusion is always a bit mitigated. The relationship is highly dependent on environmental scenarios. I think we all know that. All crop physiologists will tell you it depends. It depends on lots of things. And unfortunately, and I worked in the CG before, and I think Jana can say the same thing, most of the physiological adaptive traits have not really been considered per se in the breeding programs. And that's unfortunate that we had this connection between those two things. Okay, so this was the case so far, and in the recent years, we're witnessing the expansion of those kind of platforms, from intensive field experiment to lean field modeling platform, etc. So basically, what we would call a sensor to plant type of platform, which has been growing, and you've seen lots of examples in the presentations here. Those are two examples from France, the Phenomobile V1 by Hyphen and the Phenofield gantry system from Arvalis. And there are many, many others in different places in the world. So what about Africa in all of that? We would all agree that this is still a bottleneck, and a bottleneck in Africa too, like elsewhere in the world, like in the global north. Again, going back to the same survey and the publication by IPPN, if we look closely at this map, then we would see that most of the infrastructure around the world are concentrated in the global north, mainly in Europe, in the US, Australia, etc. And there is very, very few, not to say nothing much, happening in Africa. So the map is quite blank, but actually there are things happening in Africa, except that we really don't know what's going on, because it's still very loose and disconnected. There is a lack of phenotyping infrastructure in Africa, and there are, as I said, few examples, like this one in Isra Bambé in Senegal, that is a national agricultural system with lysimetric tubes copied on Yana's system in Ecrisat, and another field scan, a 3D gantry system in South Africa, and the South African colleague from the, different institutions have been awarded a grant to expand that a bit further. So I myself contributed to developing two of those systems in Morocco. So there is the Physiotron that was later on implemented by ICARDA in Morocco with those lysimetric tubes. And most recently, during my term at UM6P, I've contributed to the development of the Phenoma platform, and I really invite you to listen to Moez Amri's presentation. He would be detailing what it is about. I'm not going to go into the details. So there are some examples of some of these platforms in Africa, but not much happening. But the question is, do we really need this kind of heavy and costly infrastructure all over Africa? I personally think it's useful to a certain extent, but I think we should not generalize that. So I've spoken about infrastructure first. I'll speak about plants next. The same survey tells you that most of the plants that were mentioned are of crops of interest to the global north. You know, wheat, with no surprise, Arabidopsis, even if it's not a crop yet. But maize, barley, of course, canola. But if you look at the data on what is important in different parts of Africa, we don't really see those plants, maybe except in Northern Africa where wheat is important. Of course, maize is important all over Africa, but most of these plants that come here, roots and tubers, are not enough covered by the technologies that we develop. So what about the African forgotten crops, that are gaining interest in the recent couple of years? There is a growing interest in bringing back those crops into the food systems, but they come in different shapes and architecture. Take fonio, teff, etc., and the grain legumes. Those require a different set of pipelines other than the one that we used on having for the major mainstream crops. So second were the crops. The third thing is dealing with spatial and temporal variation in field conditions. We've all used, and if you look at most of the presentation, you would have this kind of neat and clean expected setup where you have square fields, nothing going all over the fence. But that's a global north expected setup. Those are fields from the global north, even in Brazil, etc. But this is not always the reality in entire Africa. Take sub-Saharan Africa as an example. That's a field there. And you can see there's a spatial variability on millet growth because of human settlement. That's quite an old example, I mean 1996. How do we deal with this spatial variability when the reality in Africa is a bit different? Even if we go for what is gaining much interest, which is agroforestry. Those are two examples of agroforestry setups in France, in Restin-Clière and Moyo, and they're always very clean and neat, and the trees are always put on an equidistant basis. Even though this kind of setups still has to benefit from the advancement of phenotyping, because it has many challenges, and I think the community would agree with me that this is quite challenging even in the global north. But if you look at this kind of setups in the global south, like this Federbia pearl millet intercropping system, those nice trees here are Federbia albida. They have a reverse type of phenology, so they would have their leaves during the dry season, which is quite interesting, and they would act as a hydraulic lift. But that's actually the setup in Africa compared to others. And you see, that's a parkland in West Africa, smallholder agricultural landscape. And there's, as you can see, high spatial heterogeneity between the different things. So if you want to look at this is an actual experimental setup, and looking at the effect of Federbia albida, and obviously you see that pearl millet is growing better under those trees. So if you want to look at that experimental setup, you will have to have a different set of mind to model the random intercropping system. So the actual setup is far from the modeling and imaging standards that we are used on having, even if you want to fly drones. You would go and follow a real way of handling those things. While if you go for the actual random implementation of these intercropping systems, then you will have to come up with different technologies and different ways of doing so. So Romain Fernandez, a colleague of mine who has been looking into those systems, he had called upon techniques that are used in medical imaging to look at the effect and the influence as a function of a distance. So that's the Federbia tree, and the influence of each Federbia tree on its surrounding, and how do you calculate that, given that it's a random distribution of the trees, and trees that are not absolutely not aligned, they are distributed a bit randomly. And he's done that to look at the average F cover around those Federbia albida, and how is this influence is limited within the space, and how do you calculate the difference between the influence for one tree against the influence of another tree. So I talked about the spatial and heterogeneity before. If we go to Africa, we also have a wide array of production systems. Take sorghum as an example. You have many kinds of production system. Comes here on a sole cropping or as a rotation. It comes with an intercropping with cowpea or groundnut and many other legumes. It goes under parkland agroforestry in trees like the one I've shown before. You have different other ways of cultivating sorghum in sub-Saharan Africa, in half moons, in post-rainy floodplains, in this interesting system called Zai or Tassa, whatever. So you have a wide array of G by E by M, or even in the case of intercropping, a G by G, because you have two different genotype by E by M, and then you have a lot of different combinations. So how do we also deal with these kinds of systems that are quite different from those that we are used on dealing with in the global north? So that's really a challenge to look at the spatial and temporal variation in the field. The bottom line is that the African agricultural landscapes mostly are not comparable to those of the global north, and that we need to address them maybe in a different way. So now I've talked about the spatial and temporal variation in the field. Let me talk about the equipment that we use. Sometimes, I'm not saying all the equipment will be used. I took the case of this multispectral sensor. I hope that there is no industry in the room that manufacture that. I guess not. I'm just hoping. If not, I apologize in advance, but that was the... So Denis Cornet, a friend and a colleague, wanted to implement that multispectral sensor and use it in Africa. And he actually realized that the radiance values that were calculated by the manufacturer were biased somehow because they were fixed on conditions that are related to temperate regions. So if you use it as such, if you didn't implement some corrections, then you would have errors in radiance that will have a direct influence on the reflectance that are obtained by this kind of machine, and therefore on the vegetation index values and so on and so forth. And you will end up having measurements that are not quite relevant or not quite useful in that case. So in some cases, the material is unsuitable. We need to rethink the material to adapt to the African conditions. Now we go to data. I mean, there is no surprise that all of these platforms, even those who are in the field, generate huge amounts of data that are calculated in terabytes per year. Take the example of the FSIS network all across Europe. You have a dozen European countries. Just imagine how many, if you just take 12 sides, one top view, you make a simple calculation and you reach out huge numbers. So how do you deal with the data infrastructure in Africa? In the global north, we're already struggling with that. So what do you want to say about Africa, where sometimes, luckily, investments have been made? I mean, look at this example. This example in 2021, where Senegal acquired a supercomputer, which was really great, and that could be leveraged and used by those who want to do some kind of phenotyping. But unfortunately, this supercomputer has been sitting there and hasn't been used. And I bet it would be a bit outdated in a couple of years, if not already outdated. And the former president, I guess, I took that from a newspaper. Translate that Macky Sall is a bit impatient about this supercomputer being set to work. So we need to rethink the data infrastructure. It's not always throwing some of the equipment over there and then saying, okay, you guys have a supercomputer, then that's great. Now we will be able to make use out of that. The other thing is, of course, the technical personnel. We often welcome trainees, master students, Ph.D. students, brilliant minds that come to us in CIRAD and elsewhere for training. But unfortunately, they would stay in France and they would not return and go back to Africa because they don't find enough opportunities. So there is a loss of that kind of trained and lacked and skilled personnel. And sometimes even the teaching that we provide them is absolutely not suitable because we are not dealing and it's not actually tailored to some extent to their needs. So there is also something that needs to be made when it comes to the human capital of that kind of thing. Okay, now there's also another problem on top of all of these. I'm sorry if I'm painting a very black. I'll try, to cheer up at the end. Maybe not. So I'm just talking about boundaries so far. So bear with me. So if you want to express that you're so sad and cry. I mean, I would also cry because the situation is really not always bright. But there are light somewhere, and I've shown you some of the infrastructure and some of the colleagues that have been developing that and doing so. So there's also another problem there. It's the regulation controlling the emerging technologies. Take drones as an example. I mean, Moise knows something about that. When we were in Morocco, we bought a drone, but in order to fly that drone over the field, you need to have authorization from the Air Force, the préfet, the governor, etc., etc., etc. And you might end up letting go just because it's too much work in order to fly a drone for 50 minutes or 15 minutes and get the data. So there's also a problem that makes some of these high throughput techniques implemented by multinational research institutions. And I think the experience of Jana in that respect when it comes to flying drones in India and elsewhere is completely relevant to that. Okay, so with all of these problems, there is another issue is the fact that we have a weak inter-African collaboration when it comes to phenotyping. There are things going on in the African continent. I'm not saying otherwise, but they're scattered. We most probably don't know what's going on. We know that things are happening because we have individual connections with certain numbers of research institutes and so on and so forth. But there is no such comprehensive way of looking at what's really happening in Africa and to which extent the African institutions are collaborating amongst themselves. There are a few examples of few things, as I said, happening that are quite encouraging. There is the West African Field Phenotyping Network, but that's only for field phenotyping, and they don't have the same level of technology deployed in different spaces. And with all the problems, the political problems happening in West Africa now, with countries taking different directions, getting out of the CEDEAO, which is, I mean, makes things a lot more difficult. And above all, there is no African plant phenotyping network. I should put AFPPN because there is enough APPNs around the table. No, but you have an APPN, so you have, it's a registered trademark, so we should. And you don't have an African emphasis. So far, you don't have the equivalent of the European phenotyping network in Africa. And actually, with some colleagues that are here today, Jana, Moise, Philip, John, Francisco, am I forgetting someone?
Yeah.
Yeah, Willem. Oh, yeah, sorry for that. This Marike and other colleagues, we tried to apply for funding. We tried to convince the European Union to fund us to go for this kind of current situation where you have things happening mostly in Europe and going down on a bilateral basis and on what we tend to call let me tell you approach, which means the Europeans or the global north telling the Africans what they need to do because they happen to know better, which is, I tend to disagree with that kind of statement, and I think Philip does too. Okay, so we tried to go from this current situation to that future where we could see an African plant phenotyping network interacting amongst themselves and interacting also on an equal basis with the European, because it was a European project. But the idea is with the global community to look into that and even foster those internal collaboration. We had a series of partners, Morocco, and use cases, another one in Ghana, South Africa, because those are two who have already established or are establishing phenotyping networks. We were about to scope and map the needs of the African phenotyping network and looking for mutual learning and experience sharing rather than just going one way. Unfortunately, we didn't get funding for that project, but this is not the end of it, because not later than yesterday night, we were discussing how to take that a bit further. So the effort, I hope the effort will not stop here, and that we will increase and encourage the inter-African collaboration, and of course the African, European, Australian, American, etc. Collaboration in order to reach out to what we can call the African plant phenotyping network that could be up and running, because as I said, the situation is not that as dark as I presented. There are some lights somewhere, so let's work on these lights in order to make them interconnected and make an impact there. And of course, I think because there is not much happening in the African continent, there's a way of learning of the failures that we encountered in the global north. So the idea is not taking another PhenoArch and having plenty of PhenoArch and all sorts of technologies deployed everywhere in Africa. No, the idea is just learn from what we missed in the global north, and so in order not to reproduce the same mistakes in a continent that has a huge potential, huge challenges, and where not much things are happening, but they're starting. So let's not miss that, and otherwise the consequences could be really big. So I'm not announcing anything, but I think the next IPPS symposium would take place on the African continent, which is a great thing. I think that's something that needs to be encouraged, so we can take that into Africa, but also leverage on what's existing there in Africa. I also told you about the APIA continuity. We're also working on some kind of a white paper, position paper. So I invite those who are interested in phenotyping in Africa to reach out to me or to the other colleagues that I just mentioned, Moez, Jana, Philip, and many, many others. So we can, if you're interested in joining that position paper, so you're more than welcome to do so. Okay, so I still have plenty of time, but I'm on my last slide. Okay, so I just wanted to tell you that the hardships that are encountered, that I listed here in Africa, could also be encountered in elsewhere. I mean, take Spain as an example. It's a dry area, and it's getting drier and hotter. So the problems that we may encounter sometimes with the equipment could be also encountered in the global north and will be encountered in the global north. So we have to take that into consideration. All these hardships are not specific to Africa. There are things that are specific to Africa that we need to take on board, and others that are not. We also need to look at the cost effectiveness. As I mentioned earlier, the idea is not to implement those costly equipment and infrastructure all over Africa, because there is a problem. Even if you manage to get a big project with a couple of $1 million to get one of these phenotyping platforms up and running there. So how do you keep that running on the long run? Those who have developed phenotyping platforms, Moez, Yana, know something about that, because the idea is not to get it up, you also need to sustain it on the long run. So how do we look at the cost effectiveness and the cost effective technologies and maybe cheap technologies that we need to put into Africa in a way that deals with these problems. We also I also mentioned the African crops, the specificities of African crops, and the development of specific pipelines for those crops. You all are aware that these crops are gaining interest. There are lots of initiatives going on. VAX is one of them that are putting light on these crops. So we need to address that in order not to miss that and arrive and say, we have our wheat pipeline. It works perfectly. No, it won't work perfectly on other kind of crops. So dealing with those African crops is important. And again, thinking of affordable, as I said, easy to handle, reliable phenotyping tools that are tailored to the African needs by listening to what Africa really needs rather than imposing models that have been developed by the Global North and for the Global North. With that, I want to thank you, and I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great presentation, Chinajam from Purdue University. And this was more like an enlightening moment that as a research scientist in North America, and I've been mainly hearing from Europe, and there is another big part of the globe that we also need to pay attention. And my question is that it is really great when we get to know that there is a lot of needs in African continent, but your discussion is mainly focused on hardware in that part in terms of the infrastructure. But I think that the other important piece of this is software part. So can you address some of those challenges that you encountered in African continent in terms of software infrastructure?
Okay, so I hinted to that in my presentation when I pointed out to the fact that we will be generating lots of data. But then what do you do with the data? You need to have a proper way of treating all of these things. It's not about just storing them somewhere. And I guess, again, looking at the development of softwares that are easy to handle, that you can maybe use very low cost techniques could be important there, because the capacity is there, but you need to develop something that is specifically directed to that. So I'm not saying that the data and what goes beyond the data, of course it is important.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks, Michel, for that. That a lot of insights, very helpful indeed. I would just like to hear your ideas on one point, because when you mentioned, or you had the example of the pattern of agricultural sites and field sites, and then you had a very nice formulation about the mindset thing. The challenge being the mindset, and I guess this is an underlying topic of all the other issues as well. Now, from the solution side, do you have any expectations or ideas how we could address this mindset aspect as a community?
First and foremost, avoid what I call the "let me tell you" thing. Is that maybe learn from what's happening in Africa instead of coming. Let's be humble sometimes that we really don't know the situation there. I work in a French institution. Africa is a big continent with lots of variation, and the ones who know the most what's going on there are the Africans. So maybe we need to learn from them and change our mindset in a way that we're not bringing the solutions to them, but we're writing that. It's like imagining a book. Either you give a written page, you handle that, and it's done, or you look at a page that is half written by those who have developed all of these technologies, but there's still the other half that needs to be written, and instead of writing it and imposing it, then let's write it together. And that's the change of mindset that needs to be operated, I guess, in the community.
Professor Ghanem, yeah, Richard Dickman from another APPN. You talk about hardware and software, but what about humanware? Training of people and so on. So, is there adequate training there, and are there scholarship programs and so on to train new people? And the second thing is, second part of the question, well, not related, but really around the low-cost phenotyping, and I mean the obvious direction is drones. So, do you see any developments or any way in which it will somehow be liberated to allow you to use drones more easily?
Yeah, so for the human part, I think there was a slide about the training that we provide, and of course there are lots of, I see, I mean, in my own institution, I see people coming for training, brilliant minds, but when they go back, they face hardship to implement some of these things. Because it's not enough, and sometimes the training, the content of the training itself is not adapted, because if you go and teach them how to fly a drone over a field in Europe, say, I mean the technology would not be as easy and as straightforward taken, just like that. We need to maybe dovetail some of the training material. Yeah. There are brilliant minds, and most of the African students, you have a huge potential there, and I guess there is, the potential is there. You just need to make it in the training content itself, and working on providing them opportunities where they are actually, because otherwise you will end up having a highly trained scientist that could solve many, many problems, but when he goes back, I mean, we have lots of examples of people in Senegal. I mean, we have a brilliant guy in our own institution, went back to Senegal. He's all over the place, because he's going all the way from looking at cows to plants, etc., etc. So the conditions are not that good. Drones that are gaining attention, and it's getting more and more easier. It's getting easier to fly them, and I think that's one of the things that we need further to explore in the future, specifically for Africa, because they could provide lots of information. So I think that's an avenue where we need to put money and mind there.
Thanks for that talk already. Sorry, over here to your right. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Hello.
It's going. Oh, yes.
Thanks for the talk already. I was curious because you share this vision from, perhaps it is a little bit more from an academia point of view, but I'm in the global north, it's a funnel from academia down to breeding companies, giving new varieties down to growers and then to consumers. If you take that view, how does that view apply to Africa, and what knowledge could we learn from that point of view?
Yeah, you mean changing a bit perspective from academia to industry and applied?
Well, I think I acknowledge directly that academia has a role, but I would assume that there are more roles to play, let's call it like that. And what can we learn from that viewpoint?
Yeah, you see, I think even in terms of breeding, the breeding companies that go to Africa are mostly coming from the north. There are little African companies, African-owned companies that develop their own crops. So maybe we need to look into that a bit more, rather than, and even if those multinational companies that go to Africa, because there is a market and there's a big opportunity there. I think we need to change that mindset. Of course, as I said, I could only talk about the academic perspective, but there is also a need to look at that from the industry perspective.
What would it take to enable those small African-owned breeding companies? How do those get enabled?
Well, they will have to have funding to work on their own crops, and instead of spending most of the money working on those major mainstream crops and sending maize and more maize and more maize. Why don't we and soybean? Why don't you? I have nothing against maize and soybean, but I think we have to look at the African crops that have that are important. So the breeding company, the local breeding companies need to look to those things, because I mean, multinational breeding companies don't have the market or the interest in looking at some of these crops, because simply, I mean, you would prefer to work on wheat rather than work on fonio, because the market is so small and the area covered is a bit less. But you can enable some of the local companies to work on that.
So I would like to have your perspective on the following. I work together with a Tunisian colleague, and in their institute they're pretty well off in buying good equipment, but they say the problem arises if they have the equipment serviced, because if something goes wrong or when something has to be maintained, they have to fly over technicians from Europe, and it costs so incredibly much of money that gets stuck and the apparatus is not used anymore. And as long as there is no density of such institutes in Africa, how can we go around that problem?
Well, very good point. I guess I've seen so many in one-shot investments in all around Africa, in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, and elsewhere. And the problem of maintenance and the costs of maintenance is a big issue. So there are two ways around that. Either you develop something that is quite cheap and that you can replace relatively quickly, or you build up the local expertise on that. And I think there are, I mean, Moise has shown in his presentation a homemade phenotyping platform. I mean, that Morocco does not lack qualified skills to generate. The lysometric platform was entirely made in Morocco with a Moroccan company that uses Moroccan knowledge, and it's easy to maintain this way. Of course, the Phenomobile is in France, but you can fly that. So I think there is no straightforward answer for that. Either we develop things that are cheap enough that we can replace relatively quickly. Jana talked about some of these relatively low cost phenotyping things, or we have to build the local knowledge about those things, or do both.
Michel, what would you expect to be the political situation in African countries in regards to realizing plant phenotyping projects in that sense that Hendrik just mentioned? So what are the maybe potential political constraints there when it comes to project management for high throughput plant phenotyping or even low throughput plant phenotyping?
Yeah, I guess the regulatory issues is for flying some of these devices, if you want to use UAVs, etc. There's also the political will of, generally speaking, above and beyond the African policymakers that do not prioritize so far projects that could include phenotyping components. I mean, so far everything is, if you look at the European calls, etc., that are directed to Africa, you would barely find a place within those calls that could fund the establishment of phenotyping platforms. So I think there is something that needs to be done also with the African Union level to make sure that within the next coming calls we get this into the pipeline in somehow, and then the regulation of these getting equipment in and out, and flying within, making it easier for people to use.
Question from here. Before I give you my question, I see that the plant there was starting to grow from seed, but today for the African session, it's flowering, and I think this is a good sign. My question is related to the egg chicken approach. You know that there is building the infrastructure, but in the other side, there is building capacities. Today, all the capacities, to build the capacities, African scientists or, early career scientist students, they go to the global north to use partly or to learn how to deal with these phenotyping platforms, high throughput especially. But when you try to build, you need these people to come back, and there is no evidence that they will come back. The experience in Morocco was first to build, the platform, and build then in the second time the internal expertise through partnership and collaboration. Unfortunately, the APIA project that you presented was one of maybe the pillars that could take this and contribute in such kind of things. But how do you consider, or how do you see this kind of, which one we should go for first, and then how it could be at some crystal?
I'm afraid there is no such thing. There is no straightforward answer for that. I think you need to work on both fronts. The thing of jumping immediately into building infrastructure, I think we need to avoid mimicking what's happening in the north or what people have seen in developing institutions. I'll give you an example. When I used to work for the CG at ICARDA, was supposed to set up a phenotyping platform for drought and heat in Sudan with the national system. We luckily ended up having it in Morocco instead of having it in Sudan, with all the problems, unfortunately, in that country. And I still remember the Sudanese colleagues going to CIMIT and looking at all these facilities and, wanting some of the equipment. I'm not going to mention any of these equipment here. Okay. So, and I think Yana had similar issues. The problem is that when they come and see what's happening elsewhere, you would want to reproduce that in your own country without even knowing if this is useful. Sometimes you can do lots of things with very little stuff. So building infrastructure needs to be thought, and there is an opportunity because there is much less, and it needs to be thought based on the scientific questions, not on the technology development. That's the first thing. And we have this opportunity in Africa because it's still somehow more or less a clear space where you can make at the same time lots of mistakes, but you can make the right decisions by learning from what went wrong elsewhere. The second thing is building capacity, and I do agree with what you said. If you don't provide, specifically in Africa, people with opportunities for work, to go back and have stable jobs where they are assured that they can have a salary at the end of the month and they can implement some of the projects, etc. You can build any kind of infrastructure, state-of-the-art one, if nobody's there to make it run and nobody's there locally to make it run, it won't fly, and it will end as just like all the investment that has happened in many, many places. You've seen ARC centers in Egypt, funded by USAID, very nice center built by the US government in the 80s. Unfortunately, when the project funding ended, nothing was happening and it was all falling back. So we need to work on both sides, on capacity development. I hate that word, but because there is lots of capacity, we need to foster that and make sure that they have stable jobs, stable employment, and they are trained in a proper way to serve their Africa for the African needs and not otherwise. And I think a way of convincing the global North donors, maybe the European ones, is precisely the point that Yuma mentioned. Because, take the crops that today and the conditions of Africa today, they are going to be tomorrow's conditions in Southern Europe. So we have maybe to tell these guys that who decide that actually this is a place where that could be useful. I mean, not only for Africa, but also for those who are sitting in more developing countries.
Michel, I would love to hear your voice and your opinion on the following aspect. I think we've talked about a lot of the problems today in the morning that are obviously there. But it seems to me that there's another aspect. So when it comes to funding and technology, I guess there's a lot of power in the global north, as we call it. But I wonder if there's another way around, because when it comes to farming practices, also you just mentioned climate resilient species in the future, there's a lot of knowledge in the global south that we could learn of in the global north. Sure. So I just would like to hear what you see in that aspect and how you would assess the situation.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, if you take crops that has been growing in harsh conditions, just sorghum as an example, in some places in southern France, maybe in the next few years, we won't be able to grow maize anymore because, simply because the conditions are changing and because of climate change, etc. And there is knowledge and material in the south, specifically on some of these crops that could solve the issue and tick some of the boxes. So for once, maybe we can turn the story a bit differently from learning from what's happening in the north and implementing it in the south, than saying, as I just said to Moise, that there are things that have been, crops that have been growing there for thousands of years. There is a local knowledge about these things that could serve what would be the future in the north. And I think we need to turn the tide a bit, and tell the story a bit differently, so they get aware of the importance and the opportunities also for the north in that respect.
Thanks for the interesting talk. You described some of the challenges involved with drone-based phenotyping, and it sounds like those challenges they can't really be solved by phenotypers. They're very political. I was wondering, so if you've thought about the possibilities for satellite-based phenotyping, and obviously there's lots of limitations with that kind of data, but it's already being collected and that there are some emerging possibilities there.
Yes, I think I didn't mention that because that falls a bit outside of my area of expertise, but I think that's one of the things that could be leveraged for, because the satellites are going on anyways. So, and you'll have imaging, and this technology has been improving throughout the years. So I talked here specifically about some of the things that have been ground-based or phenotyping platforms in the classical sense of the in the classical definition. But definitely, these are, we need to look at the entire chain of what we could have in terms of opportunities and technologies, and see which one we could leverage to answer which questions. I think it's important to bear in mind the questions that we want to have. Otherwise, we will fall again into the technology-driven type of reasoning.
There are some great studies already from across Africa with, like you mentioned, baobab as a I don't know its use as a crop species, but there's some really.
It's not grown, but it's eaten and consumed, and leaves are consumed, fruits too.
There's some really nice work mapping baobabs across sub-Saharan Africa, at really large scale stuff. So.
Yeah, and there are other tree. You mentioned baobab, but there are also other tree crops like the shea, the karité in French. Those who are many organizations have been planting those all across because they have a market opportunity. But if you want to know when to harvest that, you need. Satellite imaging could be one of the things that you can leverage. Even drone flights would tell you. What happened to what many NGOs have we've been contacted by a specific NGO that has been having projects on shea and they actually don't know what happened to the trees that were planted in like 10-year project. So that could be something of, simple applications that tells you what happened to the trees. And if those trees are still there, then when are they supposed to harvest those? So, having simple techniques, solving issues that and having implications on people's lives and adding economic value.